I'm Joni Sussman. I am a child of 2 Holocaust survivors, and I've been invited to speak today to tell you a little bit about my parents' story. There are many books and other publications available, but to be able to hear directly from a survivor family, I think makes a difference in a big way. We are in the middle of losing many of our survivors who won't be able to speak for themselves, and so we, the second generation, are taking this opportunity to tell our stories. So I'm going to talk about my parents' story. My parents were both from Lithuania, a town called Šiauliai. I think it's the 3rd biggest city in Lithuania. And the war had started earlier in Western Europe, and now it was coming to their part of the world. My mother was 19 when the war started. She had finished her freshman year at the University of Vilnius, and she happened to be home for the summer. The Nazis came in July, and so my mom was home with her brother. My mother was the oldest. She had a younger brother and a younger sister, and her parents. She always said she was fortunate to be home at that time because if it had been during the school year, she doesn't know if she would have been able to be with her family. So when the Nazis came in, they put in force all of the laws that they had put in force in other countries prior to that. So these were the Nuremberg laws, and these laws were only allowed the Jews to do certain things. For example, Jewish doctors could not treat non-Jewish patients. Jewish businesses were taken away. Jewish kids could not go to secular schools. So many changes came right away. However, nobody knew what was really going to be coming down the road. So at the beginning, everybody thought that the world was as usual. They thought they were still Lithuanian citizens. They thought that they still had rights. They thought that if there was a fire in their house, the fire department would come, and that if they had a robbery, the police would come. And as it turns out, all those things had changed overnight. They were no longer considered to be citizens, and they had no rights. And this was a huge change for them. And as an example of that, I'll tell you a story. One day in that summer, the Nazis came and they rounded up all of the men in my mother's neighborhood, and they took them away. And my mother said to her mother, "They took Papa. What did he do? He didn't do anything. I'm going to go and have him released. I'm going to find out what's going on." And so this young woman, 19 years old, went to Gestapo headquarters, which you can imagine was just a crazy thing to do. She went to Gestapo headquarters and she asked to speak with the commandant. Now, my mother spoke 7 languages fluently because Lithuania had been under the rule of a number of different countries. She spoke Lithuanian, she spoke Russian, she spoke German, she spoke French, many languages, and among the languages that she spoke was German. And so she asks to speak to the commandant, and the commandant agrees to give her a couple of moments. It's a young woman, and she comes in and speaks to him in fluent German, and she says to him, "Excuse me, Commandant, but my father has been arrested. He didn't do anything wrong, and please release him." You can imagine the nerve of something like this, a teenage girl coming to, tell the Gestapo what to do. But the commandant looked at her and he said, "How is it that a Jewish girl speaks such a beautiful German?" And my mother said, "Well, I went to a German school for a while, and so that's where I learned to speak German." And he said, "Because you speak such beautiful German and because you've asked so nicely, I'll release your father." And so my mother thought, great, and she comes home and her mother is in the kitchen with friends drinking coffee, and my mother says to them, "Papa's coming home." And they all sat her down on a chair and put a cold washcloth on her head. They couldn't believe that this was happening, but indeed the very next day my grandfather was released. The other men were not, and were taken to labor camps. And I tell you this story so you can see how capricious the world was in those days. You had no idea what was going to happen at any given time. Well, as many of you know, what came after the Nazis came in and implemented the Nuremberg laws, the next step was to separate the Jews and move them into ghettos. Now, we all know what was to come, but you have to remember that the people at the time did not. And so it came time for them to go into ghettos. The word came out that on a certain day, everybody, all the Jews in the city, had to move into what was the poorest part of town, wooden buildings, a very sort of connected area. And it didn't matter whether you were rich or poor, a big family, a small family, single, married, all the Jews had to report to the ghetto. Now, how did they know which families were Jews and which did not? In those days, everybody had to carry what we in the United States use our driver's licenses for, or maybe a passport. But in those days, everybody carried an ID card, and the ID card told your religion. So the Jews said, mentioned that they were Jews. And so if you were a German soldier or even a Lithuanian on the street and you asked a Jew to show ID, it would show that they were Jewish. So that's one way that they would know. The other way was that they could simply go from building to building and ask the people in the apartment building which families are Jewish families in your building, and people would actually just point out who their Jewish neighbors were. And I bring this up because there was a lot of complicity on the part of the people in Lithuania. They didn't try to protect their Jewish neighbors. They happily turned them over to whatever their fate was going to be. And so the Jews were now identified in the community. So when the time came for them to go into the ghetto, they all lined up and got to the ghetto in various ways. Now, there weren't cars in a big way in those days. Very few people had cars. And so you either needed to walk, or if you had a cart or something like that, you could use that. And that meant that you could only take into the ghetto what you could carry. So if you think about your own family, and if you would need to make a move like that, what would you take? Well, this was Lithuania, so they had 4 seasons: cold winters, warm summers. They needed clothing for all of the seasons. They needed pots and pans. They didn't know what was going to be in the ghetto in terms of what they would have, so they carried as much with them as they could. And they also tried to take things that were meaningful to them: Sabbath candlesticks, photographs, other kinds of things that would be meaningful to their families. So you can imagine, to take your photo albums and those kinds of things. The problem was that if you needed to carry everything yourself, that was going to be tricky to do. And if you had a 2-year-old, someone would have to carry the 2-year-old. And if there was an older grandparent, somebody would have to walk with the grandparent, and the grandparent wouldn't be able to carry 2 big suitcases. So you can see that at that point, what people took with them into the ghetto was only what they could carry. So they had already greatly diminished their households. Now, what was the ghetto like? So in the ghetto, these were smaller units, and even if they were apartment buildings, each family got a room rather than an entire apartment. And any of you who have read the book The Diary of Anne Frank knows what it was like for them to live with multiple families in a small amount of space. So someone would get the kitchen, somebody would get the living room, someone would get a bedroom, and each family would have to share. The people in the kitchen would need to let others cook. The people in the bedrooms would need to let others sleep. And you'll also notice that I didn't mention anything about a bathroom, and that's because these were all outdoor facilities, outhouses. The ghetto was designed for many fewer people than actually ended up living there. And so from that point on, there was typhus, there was disease. You can imagine that without good sanitary facilities, things became very, very difficult. Food was rationed. It was brought in only by the Germans. They could only have certain things, and life became very difficult. Now, what did people do in the ghettos? They were put to work. So if you were between the ages of, let's say, 12 and maybe 45, and again, those weren't exact ages, but something like that. If you were under the age of 12, you were considered to be a kid, not a worker, so of no use to the Germans. If you were over the age of, let's say, 45 or a little older, and again, old age was very different in those days in the 30s and 40s, but if you were over the age of 45, you were also considered to be not a useful worker. And as a result, the people in those 2 age groups, the older people were in the ghetto taking care of the children, and all of the people who were between the ages of 12 and 45 or so were taken out as slave laborers to work in factories. Now, there happened to be a factory right across the street from the ghetto. I've actually seen that factory. I was in Lithuania about 10 years ago on a family pilgrimage back to the place that my parents lived. But this was a factory that made various kinds of leather goods. This part of Lithuania was famous for its tanneries and its leather goods. In fact, my grandfather, the guy who had been arrested, had been a shoe designer working in a leather factory. But the slave laborers every morning were lined up and taken across the street to work in the factory. Well, one day, my mother describes, they were working in the factory, and some of the windows overlooked the ghetto area. And my mom said this particular day she was looking out the windows from maybe the third floor, looking over into the ghetto, and she noticed a bunch of trucks driving into the ghetto. And it was a little bit far away, so she couldn't quite see what was going on, but she saw the trucks driving around for some hours, and later on in the day, the trucks left the ghetto. Well, when the slave laborers came back into the ghetto that evening, all the children were gone. And you can only imagine what it would have been like if you were a parent and had left your child in the care of, others in the ghetto to go to work in the factory, and you come home that night and your children are gone. People were terrified. And of course, the very first thing they did was asking the seniors, the 45 and up people, what happened? What happened to the kids? And the people said, the Germans came in with their trucks with Ukrainian helpers, and they went from house to house and they collected all of the kids. And even if some of the older people wanted to go with the children, they weren't allowed, and they took the children away. Where did they take them? Where did they go? And some of the people said that they took them to Switzerland. Now, as you might know, Switzerland was a neutral country at the time, and if indeed the children had been taken to Switzerland, that would have been a good thing. But in fact, the children were taken to Auschwitz. Now, the German word for Switzerland is der Schweiz. And when the people asked the soldiers, where are you taking the kids? They said Auschwitz. The people heard it as der Schweiz because they had never heard of Auschwitz. Auschwitz was not a name that anybody knew of in those days. And indeed, the children had been taken away to Auschwitz. Well, you can imagine what it was like in the ghetto after all of the children were gone. People were so downhearted. Now, why would the Nazis have done this and taken the kids? Well, for one thing, the children were of no use to them. They couldn't work, and they just took up food, and the Germans weren't interested in keeping them alive. When my parents were moving out of the house that I grew up in, they were empty nesters, they were downsizing. Their friends said, oh, you should move into these lovely senior apartments. It'll be great, it'll be so quiet, there's no kids. And my parents said, we never want to live in a world without children. We have done that. And that was one of the legacies, I think, of living in those ghetto years. So going back now to the ghetto, after the children left, this was really the beginning of winding down and preparing for the concentration camps, although, of course, the people in the ghetto did not know that. Again, there was no social media, there was no internet, there were radios, but they had very little radio access. It needed to be secret. They got very few newspapers. The ghetto was very closely guarded so that information really didn't get in. So one day, there is a notification that everybody needs to come and assemble in the plaza. They are going to be moving out of the ghetto. Nobody knows where they're going. Nobody knows what's going to be happening, but they gather in the plaza, which is near a railroad track, and you've probably seen scenes like this in movies. Everybody was put onto trains. They didn't know where they were going. Now, these trains were, of course, not passenger trains. They were boxcars that had taken animals and feed and other kinds of things across Europe. They were crammed into these boxcars. Men, women, children, people who were pregnant, people who were sick. By then, there were many people who were weak. Again, as I said, food and illness had been rampant in the ghetto. It was very terrible. No food, no water, and they didn't know where they were going. The trains started moving, and they started their way across Europe. My mom remembers that she was on the train for about 3 days. They didn't actually have watches. Everything, of course, had been taken from them before they got on the train. The soldiers had said, leave everything in your homes. We will, move all your baggage with you. And even though not everybody probably believed that, there really wasn't anything that they could do about it. And so they're traveling across Europe for, my mom thinks, about 3 days. And when the train stops, they are outside of Munich at Dachau Concentration Camp. Dachau still exists today as a museum, and at that point, until then, families had been together in the ghettos. People had lived together with those they loved, but when they came to Dachau, families were separated. The men were left and taken to Dachau, and the women were put back on the trains and taken elsewhere. They didn't know where they were going. So that was the point at which my mother saw her father and brother being taken away. They said their goodbyes. They didn't know if they would ever see each other again. And my mother and her younger sister and her mother, my grandmother, were put back on the train. The train went north and eventually stopped at a concentration camp called Stutthof. This was now towards the end of the war. This was already 1944. So they had been in the ghetto for a few years, and now they were heading to this concentration camp. The war, as we all know, but they didn't know, was starting to wind down. The Germans were sort of stuck in the middle. They had an eastern front against the Russians. They had a western front with the Western Allies. And the camp that my mother was in was kind of right in the middle, in the north, but right in the middle of all of these sections. The camp that my mother was in was exclusively women. Her group was exclusively women. And when they came to Stutthof, they took 1,000 women, including my mother, my grandmother, and my aunt, who was then a teenager, about 15. And they took them to sort of a labor camp outside of the main camp of Stutthof. It was quite a ways away. They lived in big tents with a number of people per tent. The tents were just made out of canvas. They had a raised wood floor. They slept on the floor, no beds, no nothing. And this was in the summer of 1944. The job that the women were given was to dig anti-tank ditches. And anti-tank ditches, as you perhaps know, are huge ditches that come to a V at the bottom. And the idea was Hitler at the time was digging 2 sets of anti-tank ditches across Europe. One was to keep the Russians out coming from the east. The other was to keep the Allies out coming from the west, with the idea that the tanks would fall into these anti-tank ditches and hopefully give the Germans some extra time. You can imagine what it was like having these women digging anti-tank ditches with pickaxes, and that is what they did. They were divided into groups of 5. They were taken down into these pits where they, for 10 hours a day, dug with pickaxes, making these anti-tank ditches. The Nazi soldiers, the guards, would march back and forth along the top of the ditches, keeping guard, and if they saw anybody speaking or laughing or anything like that, they just aimed their guns down into the ditches and they would shoot the workers. So it was a very, very scary time. My mom said this was the saddest and most frightening time. They were sick. They were starving. They didn't know what was going to happen, and they were very despondent. And my mom said that in this group that she was working in with the 5 women, one of the women had been a pediatrician before the war. And she said to them, there were several young girls in this group, and my grandmother also, and she said to them, when we survive, not if we survive, but when we survive, you girls will have missed several years of your education, so we're going to start a school right here in the anti-tank ditch. And the girls said, what's going on? So what they did was each day somebody else in the group was assigned to teach. So the pediatrician taught all kinds of medical things on her day, and I was surprised when I was a kid how many medical things my mother knew, plants that would, help mosquito bites and various things that would help an upset stomach. And, my mom had never gone to medical school. I didn't know how she knew these things. My mom was studying French at the university, and she gave French lessons. Her younger sister was really just in high school, and she taught whatever it is. But one of the women in the group, her name was Lorna. She was from Belgium, and she had been a housewife before the war, so she didn't have a skill to teach in that way. And the problem with Lorna was that she always talked about food, and that was, of course, the worst thing, anathema. But Lorna talked about food, and so they said to Lorna, here's the deal. On your day, and they called it the day that Lorna cooks, on your day, Lorna, you can talk about recipes, but the deal is you can talk all day long, but at no other time other than on your day are you allowed to talk about food. And I said to my mom, how could you spend a day digging in the ditch hearing someone talk about food? And she said, Lorna was from Belgium, which was very far from Lithuania. And the things that Lorna described were not things that we had ever had. She described a recipe for pineapple cake. I mean, my mother had never seen a pineapple. She knew what it was, from books, but she had never tasted a pineapple. They didn't have that in Lithuania. And so she said these recipes never really resonated with the others because these weren't foods with which they were familiar. And when you think about it, if you see ads for hamburgers on television, the reason that those ads speak to you is because you know what a hamburger is and you can imagine what it's like. But if this was something foreign to you, it wouldn't resonate in the same way. Interestingly, my mother was a wonderful baker after the war and made wonderful things, including pineapple cake. So I don't know if that was a legacy of this, but even there, in those terrible times, instead of giving up, this little group of Jewish women had a school right there in the anti-tank ditch. And my mom always said to me, and she said this is what the pediatrician had said to them, you can have everything taken away from you, as you know. People can take away your clothes and your home and everything that you own, but they can never take away your education. What you carry in your mind is with you forever. And my mom said that turned out to be something that was very helpful to her the rest of her life. Okay, so now they've been digging in the anti-tank ditches, right? And I remember I'm telling you that this is northern Germany, so winter is coming now. It's the fall, it's November, it's December, the ground starts to freeze, and the women are scared because they're not going to be able to do anything with pickaxes once the ground freezes. So they know that there is trouble coming. So one day, in January, they get the word that there's no more digging in the anti-tank ditches, the ground is frozen, you're not going out to work. That was very frightening because they knew that as long as they could work, they would be of use to the Germans, and after that, it was an open question. So a couple of days after that, there is a roll call. Everybody from this group of the 1,000 women in the camp, living in their various tents, they all have to, in the freezing cold, come and stand in the plaza there, and the commandant is going to make a selection. And you've maybe heard of selections before. Selections are where the Nazis, for a variety of reasons, would separate people into groups. Sometimes it was to go to the gas chambers, sometimes it was for a work detail. You never really knew. And there were 1,000 people in this camp, which isn't a very big camp. Some of you maybe have gone to high schools bigger than that, meaning that many of the people in the camp knew each other, and the commandant knew many of the women in this camp. And so they all lined up, and one by one, each came to stand before the commandant. So as the line's going along, my grandmother is in line, and behind her, my mother, her older daughter, and behind my mother, the youngest, her sister, my Auntie Frida. And my grandmother is called to the front of the line, and the commandant looks at her and says, to the left. Now there's a group on the left and a group on the right, and who's going where, what does this mean? Nobody knows. But then it's my mother's turn, and she comes up, and the commandant says to her, I know you, and I know that is your mother, so you have a choice. Which direction do you want to go? You can go with your mother's group, or you can go with the other group. And my mom tells me later, now many years later, she didn't hesitate for one. She said, of course, I'm going to go with my mother. And the commandant said, yes, bitte, fine. And then my aunt comes up, and she's, again, about 17 years old at this point. And the commandant gives her the same choice. You can go with your mother and sister, or you can go with the other group, your choice. And my aunt, of course, decides to go with her mother and sister. In the group that my mother and grandmother and aunt were in, there were 90 women. The other 810, or I guess 910, in the other group are lined up in rows of 5 and marched out of the camp. Where were they going? Who knows? That left these 90 women behind. They didn't know what was happening. They slept overnight in the camp, and the next morning they too were lined up in rows of 5, getting ready to march out of camp with a guard at the front and a guard at the back. Now, they were always lined up in rows of 5, and my mother and her family, they decided that their mother would always be in the middle of the line of 5, holding on to one daughter on each side, so that should the little line of 5 ever get separated, at least the mother would be with one of the girls. And so they get ready to march out, and it's very cold. It's January. They are wearing the striped uniforms that you've seen in photographs. They're barefoot, they're starving, they're freezing, and they are on a march to who knows where. Right before they left the camp, my mother saw that her mother was shivering, and so she tore off a piece of the lining of her dress and switched it with her mother so that her mother could have this warmer piece of whatever it was to use as a scarf. So my mother exchanged scarves with her mother, and they marched out of the camp. They marched for a whole day, and again, they don't have watches, they don't know what time it is, but it got to be night, and that night they put them all into a barn, the 90 women, and people started to get hysterical. Some of them said, they're going to light us on fire, we're going to burn in this barn. And someone said, I've heard that they have false floors in the barns and they're going to drop us into a ditch. People were hysterical and starving and crazed. The night went through, nothing actually happened, but nobody got any sleep. And the next morning, they're marching on the road again. And they're marching sort of on a dirt road in a clearing. And again, this is northern Germany. There is a forest on one side and a sort of pine forest on the other side. They're marching along the road. And my mom says she looks up in the sky and the sun is kind of bright and she thinks it must be around noon, when all of a sudden the soldiers say to them, the two guards front and back say to them, quick, quick, get off the road. Nobody knows what's going on, and they look to the side of the road and there's a clearing full of deep snow. And my mom says to her mother, what do you think is going on? And her mother says, I don't know, we're hearing that the war is ending. Maybe there's, other Allied soldiers. We don't know what's going on. But, you're not going to disobey the guy with the gun. And so they start sort of scrambling off to the side of the road in very deep, knee-high snow. And they're sort of marching away, and they sort of have to let go. So they're not in their rows of 5 anymore. They're just kind of grouped together. But my mother and her sister and my grandmother are still holding hands. And as they're kind of going away from the road, all of a sudden they hear shots in the air, and they turn around, and the guards are shooting into the air, and all of a sudden they're shooting into the crowd. It's a massacre. They are getting rid of witnesses. And my mom said she was in shock. She just didn't know what was going on. But her mother, she said, realized right away what was happening. And she said to her girls, she dropped their hands and she said to them, run. And my mother grabbed her sister's hand and they ran, and my mother ran towards the guards, distracting them, shooting, don't shoot my children. And they shot her and she fell. But my mother grabbed her sister's hand and they ran into the woods. My mom said they ran and ran until finally they heard screaming and shooting, and they didn't know what was happening. And finally the sun started to go down, so it must have been like 4 o'clock in the winter. And my aunt, who it turns out that she had typhus and was sick, but they didn't know it. My mother put her hand on her sister's forehead, and she was burning up. And my mom thought, if I don't get this kid to shelter, we're not going to make it. She's not going to make it. But they decided they wanted to go back to the massacre site and see, of course, if they could find their mother. But she said, it was like Hansel and Gretel in the woods. They wandered and wandered, and they couldn't find their way back to the site. And finally, they made their way to a road, and my mom saw a sign saying the name of some town in Polish, that was so many kilometers away, and they decided they would just walk, because what else could they do? And if they stayed outside all night, they would freeze to death. And as they're walking along, out of the woods comes a woman running, somebody they know, and she said, oh my goodness, girls, you've survived. I'm so glad. And they said to her, what happened? And she said that when the shooting started, she lay down on the ground and pretended that she had been shot. Now, usually the Nazis were onto that, and they would go at the end of a massacre from person to person and shoot each one to make sure they were actually dead. But it turns out this was indeed the end of the war coming, and those guards, once they finished their shooting, they ran away. So she watched as the guards ran away, and when they were gone, she said she stood up and went from person to person to see if anyone had survived. And she said to them, I saw your mother, she's gone. And the girls said, we want to go back, we want to see her. And the woman said, I'm not taking you back there, we have to go to shelter. There's nothing you can do. And again, as an aside, I must tell you that this bothered my mother her entire life, that she doesn't know whether her mother was ever buried. She doesn't know whatever happened. And by the time we took a family trip back, my mother was already gone for many years. And this bothered her entire life, that there was no grave for her mother. But in the meantime, this woman took the two young girls and they started walking along the road, and out of the woods comes another woman, and she was holding her arm close. She had been hit by a bullet that had gone through her neck and come out under her arm, and she was holding her arm, and they took her with them. And as they got closer to this town, a total of 10 women had survived the massacre out of the 90. And this little group of 10 women made their way into this little town, and they didn't know what to do. Here they are in their concentration camp uniforms, they're shell-shocked, they're freezing, and they decide to go to the church and knock. And they did, and they thought the priest will help them. But the priest came to the door and said, "There are still Nazi soldiers in this area. We can't help you. Go away. Don't involve us in this." And they didn't know what to do, so they went and sat in the little town square, and they could see people peeking out through their curtains. It was a small town. And finally someone came up and said to them, "You can go up to this barn on the hill and stay up there for the night." And so they went up to the barn, and my mom said they went in there, and there was a cow, and it was so great. And I said to my mom, "A cow? You know, were you milking it?" And she said, "No, the cow was warm, and we put our hands on the cow to warm up." And so they stayed there overnight. They bound up the woman who was wounded. They stayed there overnight, and the next morning somebody knocked on the door and said to them, "Quick, the Russian soldiers are coming in, so stay in the barn. There's going to be a battle." And they stayed in the barn, and my mom said she could hear the shooting. And remember, she spoke these many languages, 7 languages fluently, one of which was German, one of which was Russian. So at the beginning of the battle, she's hearing all the commands in German. She knows what's going on, and by later in the day, she hears the word "agon," which is the Russian word for fire. And she knows that the Russians have come in, and in the end, the Russians liberated the village. And somebody came up onto the barn and slid the door open and said, "Come stand out here, and you will see the Russian tanks coming into the village. You are liberated." And my mom said it was both the happiest day and the saddest day of her life. Her mother was murdered one day before the end of the war. Her mother's name was Zhenya. My name is Joanna. I'm named after her. Thank you.